me tell you a story. It's 1942. America is in the midst of World War II. A young African-American man enlists in the service. He's given the uniform of the United States Army. He puts on this uniform. It's one of the proudest moments of his entire life. He travels up to Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia. From Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia, he's going to board a ship that's going to take him into Italy so he can serve overseas in this war. The night before he boards the ship, he decides he wants to have one more beer in his country. He walks off base, goes into a bar in Virginia, and orders a Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. The white woman behind the counter says, "You know we can't serve you here." He becomes very upset. He doesn't know if he'll ever come back to his country. He turns around, but before he walks out of this bar, he hears unusual noises. So he looks to his left and he looks to his right, and he sees Italian and German POWs drinking beer, relaxing, enjoying themselves in his country, but he, as a black man, cannot. He goes overseas. He fights in Italy. His jaw is dislodged by the butt of an Italian rifle. He was seriously wounded, honorably discharged, and comes back to the United States, comes back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He buys a magazine at the canteen to read on the bus ride on the way home. Boards the bus, walks halfway down the bus. Keep in mind, he's been away from the American South for 3 years, and he sits down. The white bus driver walks halfway down the bus and says, "What'd you do in the war?" So the young African-American soldier told him. The bus driver didn't believe him and said, "Well, whatever you did, you still have to go onto the back of the bus." The young African-American soldier sat there, becoming very upset. 3 years after he was away in the war, and the United States internationally was espousing the virtues of democracy, nothing from his perspective had changed in the American South. A fellow soldier said, "Go on back there because you'll get yourself killed up here." So he went to the back. That young soldier was from Greenville, South Carolina. His name is DeWitt Jackson. He still lives here in Greenville. He's in his mid-90s. He told me this story about 10 years ago. And he talked to me about how painful that experience was for him. And he talked to me about how painful it was to even tell me that story so many decades later. About 2 years after Mr. Jackson returned home, Greenville garnered the attention of the nation's media when we played host to what would become South Carolina's last lynching. In February 1947, a man named Willie Earl hired a taxi cab to take him to his mother's house. The taxi cab driver was a man named Thomas Brown. Several hours later, Thomas Brown was found mugged and beaten. He was taken to St. Francis Hospital, and he later died at St. Francis Hospital. The likely suspect was Willie Earl, who was taken into custody in Pickens County Jail. Several hours later, about 24 white men, all taxi cab drivers, gathered at the Bluebird Taxi Cab Company on Court Street near the Poinsett Hotel. They were very upset. One of their brothers had fallen. They kept going into the Poinsett Hotel to fortify themselves with alcohol. And several hours later, they formed a caravan and drove to the Pickens County Jail. They put a gun to the jailer's head. They threatened the jailer's teenage daughter. The jailer released Willie Earl to the white mob, who subsequently took him to a field, beat him to death, left his body on the side of the road, and called an African-American funeral home. There was a trial here in Greenville, in the courthouse, the old courthouse that's still on Main Street today. The simple fact that there was a trial was significant at that point in time and was interpreted as a sign of racial progress in South Carolina. Some of the men on the stand gave details of the lynching. Juries at this point in time in South Carolina were all white, all male. What do you think happened? All acquitted. A gentleman named A.J. Wittenberg, this was a very influential event on this young man. And after reflecting on this much later, he said, "If it had not happened, I probably would not have been so eager to work for the betterment of blacks. It was the fertilizer for growth." Fast forward 12 years. Baseball great Jackie Robinson, credited with breaking the major league color line, came to Greenville to speak on behalf of the NAACP, spoke at Greenville Memorial Auditorium. After his talk, Elizabeth Hall and her husband, Reverend James Hall, drove Mr. Robinson to the airport. Mr. Robinson went to the check-in counter to get his ticket. Elizabeth decided she wanted to sit down. She knew exactly what she was doing. She sat down in the whites-only waiting area. A security guard came over to her and informed her that she could not sit there. At that time, Jackie Robinson and Reverend Hall joined her. Jackie Robinson wanted to file suit, but future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall dissuaded him from doing so. There was already a suit in the works that was trying the constitutionality of segregation in Greenville's airport waiting rooms. Reverend Hall was a very young, dynamic, 26-year-old senior pastor of Springfield Baptist Church, and he was an important player in Greenville's civil rights movement. This motivated Greenvillians. Greenvillians, white and African American, were extremely embarrassed. Jackie Robinson was a national hero. 2 months later, about 300 African Americans marched the 3 miles from Springfield Baptist Church to the airport, and today the airport is the downtown airport. Some of the African American attorneys were allowed inside to negotiate. Those negotiations were not successful. Eventually, the segregated waiting areas were desegregated by court order. This event is significant. It happened on January 1st, New Year's Day, also known as Emancipation Day of 1960. If you open any American history textbook, especially an older American history textbook, it will likely suggest that the civil rights movement began on February 1st of 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, when 4 North Carolina A&T students sat down at the Woolworths and were beaten with ketchup bottles and mustard bottles. The fact that Greenville, several hundred people in Greenville marched in protest 1 month earlier, lends significant gravitas to Greenville's role in the national movement. This sparked a flurry of protest activity throughout the spring and the summer of 1960. There were pray-ins at historically white churches, there were sit-ins at lunch counters, there was a threatened swim-in at Cleveland Park's pool, and also there were study-ins at the White Library. At the White Library, a group of 8 young African Americans, most of the people who protested were students at Greenville's segregated high school, Sterling High School. A group of 8 young African Americans walked from Springfield Baptist Church to the White Library on North Main Street. They sat down. They were very nervous. One of them pulled a book off the shelf, sat down, started reading it. It was a book on George Washington's wooden teeth. Her teeth were chattering, shivering at this moment because she was so nervous. The police were called. The police came over, told these young people that if they stayed in the White Library, they were going to be arrested. They walked back to Springfield Baptist Church. They told Reverend Hall, who was waiting for them. The police said if we stayed, we were going to get arrested. Reverend Hall said, "Go back to the library. That's exactly what you're supposed to do." The students marched back to the library and were arrested. They had to be arrested. This was the only way to challenge the laws and hopefully overturn these segregation ordinances in the court of law. You may be wondering why there is an image of a black seal on the PowerPoint slide behind me. When desegregation threatened Greenville's pool, the primary white pool, public pool in Cleveland Park, City Council decided to actually close the pool to humans entirely and create a marine life exhibit. They filled the pool with seals. The marine life exhibit was extremely short-lived. Apparently, seals are not intended to live in swimming pools. They filled the pool with dirt, created a rose garden, and eventually created the tennis courts that are there today. Regarding lunch counter sit-ins, these young people, students at Sterling High School, primarily engaged in sit-ins on the weekends and in the afternoon in the spring of 1960 and all through the summer of 1960. In August of 1960, 14 young African Americans walked into the Cress on Main Street, where the CVS is today, and they sat down at the lunch counter. 4 of them were juveniles and were handled separately. 10 were arrested. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, Peterson versus Greenville. And the case was decided that the young people were in violation of Greenville's segregation ordinances. However, the segregation ordinances violated the young people's 14th Amendment rights, which provide citizenship rights. These were the ordinances that the young people had violated. So in restaurants, cafes, it was illegal to furnish meals to white persons and colored persons in the same room or at the same table or at the same counter. Separate eating utensils and separate dishes for the serving of food marked by an appropriate color scheme were required. Separate tables, counters, or booths, and a distance of at least 35 feet between the areas where white and African Americans could eat. Also in the kitchen, there had to be separate spaces for the cleaning of the utensils that African Americans and whites used. Perhaps the area of racial change that was most threatening to white parents was that of school desegregation. School desegregation was also the area that was most highly anticipated by African American parents. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court justices handed down a decision. The decision said that segregation was inherently unequal. The next year, they handed down Brown 2, which said that Southern segregated school districts must desegregate with, quote, all deliberate speed. What does that mean? If you are a white Southerner in the 1950s who's never known anything but segregation, and you were told that your school districts must desegregate with all deliberate speed, what do? You either do nothing or you find ways to obstruct the progress that you don't want to come into your town. 10 years after Brown, A.J. Wittenberg decided, the man who was so influenced by the Willie Earl lynching, decided he wanted his daughter Elaine to have better educational opportunities. He sued the school district of Greenville County and he won. His daughter and 5 other young African Americans desegregated white schools in April of 1964. That fall, 55 other young African Americans joined them. This began a process known as the Freedom of Choice Plan. Now, with the Freedom of Choice Plan, the burden was entirely upon the African American parents to apply to the school board. The school board at this point in time, all white, and they had total control over this process. They decided which African American students would be admitted, how many African American students would be admitted, and which schools would be affected by the matriculation of these African American students. After several years of this, a court decided that Greenville was obstructing integration, progress was too slow, and that the schools needed to completely integrate. A committee here established a system that reflected the racial demographics in the county, 80% white, 20% African American in each school. In February of 1970, over the course of a long weekend, we became the largest school district in the country to desegregate in the middle of the academic year, 16 years after Brown versus Board of Education mandated that we do so. Hence the title of my talk today. Bending Towards Justice comes from a Martin Luther King quote. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I'd like to argue today that we have competing interpretations of public memory here in our community. If you talk to older whites, they have a somewhat self-congratulatory attitude that Greenville avoided the banner headline grabbing violence that consumed places like Birmingham and to some extent Greensboro, North Carolina. They will often use the phrase grace and style. Greenville desegregated with grace and style. If you speak with older African Americans, they remember trying to negotiate. They remember demonstrating. They remember those actions failing. They remember having to be arrested. They remember having to use the court system. And they remember the court system forcing change upon white Greenville. They interpret it as a forced acquiescence of racial change. This disparity in public memory creates a lack of understanding, it creates a lack of empathy, and this has implications in our community. So in conclusion, I'll turn the question over to you guys. What do you think the legacy of Greenville's contested civil rights movement is? Thank you so much.